Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Could we please have you take a seat, please? Welcome to you all. I'm Stephen Souza, the president of the Davis Democratic Club. I'm glad you're all here. We have a really wonderful panel. They'll be introduced separately, but this is Professor John Sims right here. This is Sarah Bitgood right here, Sarah Patterson, and over here we have Bill Julian. And Mr. Julian has done the yeoman's amount of work to get this event going, and we all owe him a debt of gratitude. So I'd like to... I want to thank the Unitarian Church. This is a wonderful venue. In particular, Stefan, who has helped us get this rolling, and Rick back here, who is running our audio. They are just been wonderful to work with. I have a couple very brief opening statements I'd like to make. First is a quote. It's a quote from John F. Kennedy on 9/25/1961. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the steadiest, the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the news this morning. At about 8:07 in the state of Hawaii, an alert went out. That alert said this. It says emergency alert, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. This went out to all cell phones. All television emergency signals were activated. All radio stations and the sirens went off in the state of Hawaii. This went on for 30 minutes before the people were told this is a mistake. They were told that in incoming or changing of shifts, the wrong button was pushed. The button that was a test button wasn't pushed, and the live button was pushed. So I would just say I'm glad this didn't happen in the morning in which our president was watching Fox and Friends, and all of a sudden it came across the screen to him. So this is what we live with today, and I hope that we all gain some knowledge and we're able to go on and spend productive lives along with our grandchildren and our children. It is real. It's always been real in all of our lifetime, but I think it's, to me, come home again and come to the front. When I thought I had marched across the U.S. in 87 and seen a change in posture in this world, and I'm afraid that's not the case. So I will, with no further ado, turn it over to Sarah Patterson, who will introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So about a little over 10 years ago, my husband Tom and I were looking for a project we could take on after our youngest was going to go off to college, and Tom said, well, why don't we just prevent nuclear war? And, you know, what can two little people from Davis, California do about this big, important topic? Fortunately, we were directed to the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, where we are able to support people who work on these very important topics all day, every day. Of course, we support other organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Friends Committee on National Legislation. At CNS, Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, we've brought to Davis experts on the India-Pakistan crisis, Israel, Egypt, the Arab world, Iran, North Korea. And our current project is the summer undergraduate program, as well as the high school critical issues program. So our speaker today from the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, who will talk about nuclear weapons in today's world, is Ms. Sarah Bidgood. She's a graduate of Wellesley. She has a master's degree in Russian from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a master's degree in non-proliferation and terrorism studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. And she's a senior researcher for the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Please welcome Sarah Bidgood.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sarah, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'd first of all like to begin by thanking the Davis Democratic Club for putting together this very important dialogue on a really timely topic, as we heard this morning. I'd also like to thank Bill and Stephen for all of their help as I got prepared and put together my presentation, and of course, Sarah and Tom Pattison for their incredible hospitality. So I'm keenly aware that as the first speaker on this very distinguished panel, I have quite a responsibility. I need to cover a lot of ground. I'd like to give us a grounding in non-proliferation and in the non-proliferation regime. I'd like to talk about some current challenges to the regime itself and the ways that we can respond to them. And then I'm charged with tying all of this back into a conversation about restricting first use before I turn it over to my co-panelist. So I think what I'd like to begin with doing first, and I'll remind you as I go through to please think about your questions so that we can hopefully engage in a dialogue after the panel presentation, is to talk a bit about the scope of this issue. Let's see if we can.
Turn on the switch.
Yes. That's actually the first step to this presentation. Okay, here we go. So it's really important when we talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation to have a sense for exactly the numbers that we're talking about. So you can see on the screen here, I've highlighted the 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons and given estimates of their arsenals. Something that really struck me is the fact that anyone who is under 26 years of age today was born after the Cold War ended. But the 15,000 warhead legacy that this conflict, that we inherited from this conflict, is still very much alive and well. The United States and Russia, as you can see from this screen here, possess the majority of the world's nuclear arsenal. And these look like pretty staggering numbers, but it's important for us to remember as we go through the presentation that this actually represents an 80% reduction from the nuclear arsenals that these countries possessed at the height of the Cold War. So we've made some real strides, but obviously there is quite a ways to go here. Oops. There we go. So obviously, a nuclear arsenal doesn't just emerge out of thin air, and we've been hearing a lot about what that process looks like with the Iran nuclear program and also the DPRK's nuclear program. One of the most important elements to developing a nuclear arsenal has traditionally been nuclear testing, and I wanted to make sure to highlight that in particular as an issue that we can talk about today. Nuclear testing is used by countries that do not have nuclear programs to develop a nuclear arsenal that can work, and it's equally and at the same time utilized by countries that already possess nuclear weapons to develop new types of nuclear weapons. I should note here that nuclear testing isn't the only way to develop a nuclear weapon, and in fact, the weapon used in Hiroshima had not been tested previously. It was such a simple design that its designers were confident that they didn't need to test it first before it could be deployed. Now, this slide shows how many tests were conducted in the past, and all of the countries that are shown here in white stopped testing in 1998 or earlier. And although testing has not been legally banned yet for reasons that I'll get into in a separate slide, over time, a very robust norm against testing nuclear weapons has developed. And that's why it's been so alarming and so arresting to see North Korea's nuclear testing behavior. So we'll talk about that as we move further along in the presentation. So you have a nuclear arsenal, you developed it using nuclear testing. then you have to sustain your nuclear arsenal. And that's going to be a big topic of conversation for us today as we talk about some of the budgetary constraints that go into restricting first use. So maintaining a secure and effective nuclear deterrent remains a US national security and has been for quite some time. As some of you know, the United States is about to embark on a 30-year modernization program of its nuclear arsenal. The US arsenal, as many of you have probably heard, contains ground-based elements, air-based elements, and sea-based elements. And together these comprise what we call the nuclear triad. Each of these elements under current plans are going to be modernized over the next 30 years, although we'll have to see what the specifics of this plan will look like once Trump releases the nuclear posture review. Parts of this have been leaked, but we don't have the official document yet, so we'll get some more information about that from an official standpoint once that document comes out. What we do know at this time is information that's been provided by the Congressional Budget Office. They estimate that the process of maintaining and modernizing this arsenal will be costly, but also challenging from a political and diplomatic standpoint. And we'll look at what some of those challenges could be as we move through. It's worth pointing out that some practitioners have argued that the ground-based component of the US nuclear deterrent, so those are things like ICBMs based in silos, should be eliminated because these weapons are more vulnerable to a first strike attack by an opponent, and that therefore encourages policymakers to use them in a preemptive fashion so that these weapons aren't wasted. From a budgetary standpoint, it's worth pointing out that eliminating silo-based ICBMs from the US nuclear forces would also yield a 10% savings, or $120 billion, from the current modernization expenditures as they're planned right now. So we've talked about the current nuclear landscape internationally, who has what, and how they developed them. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about why only 9 countries have nuclear weapons. Why haven't other countries developed these? And what controls are in place to make sure that this doesn't happen? The measures that collectively limit the spread of nuclear weapons and prevent their proliferation are referred to as the non-proliferation regime. And this includes everything from official treaties that are negotiated and concluded at the United Nations to less formal agreements among countries who have decided to coordinate the way that they control the export of potentially dual-use material that could be used in a nuclear program. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, which I've shown on the slide here, is often referred to as the cornerstone of this regime. It's an old treaty. In 2020, it will be 50 years old, and it's quite robust. It has 190 states parties. There are 5 nuclear weapon states that are codified under the NPT, and those are the states that tested nuclear weapons prior to 1967. These countries need to commit to disarming, but under the treaty itself, there is no time frame in which they need to do this. They just need to undertake negotiations in good faith towards this objective. The other states that are party to this treaty are referred to as the non-nuclear weapon states. And these countries have pledged not to acquire nuclear weapons. And in exchange for this, they receive ready access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And this arrangement is referred to as the Grand Bargain. It's important to note that although the Non-Proliferation Treaty has endured for nearly 5 decades, it is possible for countries to withdraw. It's not an ironclad treaty. And in fact, the DPRK, North Korea, did withdraw from this treaty before beginning its nuclear program in 2003. So who monitors compliance with this treaty? Who's in charge of making sure that its obligations are upheld? To an extent, it's the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, and you may hear this referred to in the media as the UN's nuclear watchdog. So its mandate is to ensure that the nuclear materials and technology in the non-nuclear weapons states, or the states that do not possess nuclear weapons, are only used for civilian purposes and that they're not diverted to military use. And of course, we hear a lot about the IAEA in the context of the Iran nuclear deal, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And indeed, it's these inspectors from this agency who are responsible for verifying Iran's compliance with the deal. So in one of our previous slides, we looked at nuclear testing and how nuclear testing can contribute to the development of a nuclear arsenal. And I mentioned then that nuclear testing itself has not been legally prohibited. Well, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is the focus of this slide, was negotiated to ban nuclear testing anywhere, whether it's in the atmosphere, in the ocean, or underground. It's not yet enforced, however, because 44 states who are listed in the text of the treaty itself need to ratify it before it can become legally binding and before there can be actions taken to inspect states who are suspected of having conducted a nuclear test. The 8 states that have yet to ratify this treaty include the United States. And in fact, as some of you may remember, the treaty was put to a vote in 1999 in the Senate and failed to garner enough votes to pass. Nevertheless, the treaty itself has a huge and very robust and very functional international monitoring system that's capable of monitoring for nuclear tests that are conducted anywhere in the world. And one of the, if you can look for a silver lining at all in the DPRK's nuclear program, it's the fact that it has tested in real time the ability of this international monitoring system to detect nuclear tests, and it's shown its ability to do this. One of the ways that I've gotten involved on more of an advocacy side of nuclear issues, which isn't so much the focus of my day-to-day work at the center where I do mostly research, is with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization's youth branch. So it's called the CTBTO Youth Group. And I know that Bill asked me to talk a little bit about the work that I've done there, so I'll mention that now, and then we can come back around to it in our later discussion. The CTBTO Youth Group was the initiative of the executive secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. And in essence, he founded this group in 2016 because he felt that young people had a special voice and a special role to play in advancing the nuclear debate, and in particular to kind of raising the salience of the CTBT in nuclear discourse, whether it's among policymakers or just at home with your family around the dinner table. So I recently wrote an article for Teen Vogue, which has done a lot of fantastic reporting about politics and about nuclear issues, and I see some of you nodding in the audience, so I'm guessing you've read some of this coverage. It sounds surprising, but they're a fantastic resource for members of the next generation on this issue. So if anyone would like to read a copy of that, I'd be happy to send it around. So here we go. The regime to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons is old, but it's not necessarily static. And I wanted to make sure to mention the latest kind of building block. If we're looking at a wall that prevents proliferation, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the latest block in this wall. It was negotiated in July of 2017, and it's the newest of these measures that comprise the non-proliferation regime. And it was negotiated by states parties who have become frustrated with the slow pace of nuclear disarmament in the non-proliferation treaty context. And although no nuclear weapons states themselves participated in the negotiations of the treaty, and in fact, they are avowed opponents of this treaty, the treaty's proponents argue that banning something is key to establishing a norm against it. So they regard this as having a very important normative force in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and initiating the process of disarmament and moving progress towards that goal. It's not yet in force. It needs 50 ratifications in order to enter into force, but the experts with whom I've spoken feel quite confident that it will reach this goal. So we'll have to keep an eye on this space moving forward. So why do we need all of these weapons? And why do we need all of these measures to prevent their spread? Well, I think the first slide that I showed in my presentation with the numbers of weapons in various states' nuclear arsenals provides a pretty compelling reason. We see how many nuclear weapons there are and see that they're in possession of only 9 states. What if there were double that number of states? Or what if there were triple that number of states? Stephen already quoted from JFK earlier today, but I'd also like to use a quote of his to illustrate how pressing this concern was in the 1960s and how much it's underlined US nuclear policy moving forward. As you can see on the screen here, this is a quote from President Kennedy from the Kennedy-Nixon debates. He was convinced that by the end of 1964, there could be 20 or more countries with a nuclear capacity. So the policymakers during this period clearly recognized that preventing the spread of nuclear weapons was very important to US national security, and as a result, non-proliferation became a US and a global priority during this period as people started to recognize more clearly what the concerns were relating to this issue. I think another pressing concern was the buildup of enormous nuclear arsenals in both the United States and the Soviet Union as the two countries tried to deter one another from attack. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, highlighted the real danger of a potential nuclear strike and ushered in the first era of bilateral arms control efforts between Washington and Moscow. And it's against this backdrop that the notion of what we call today strategic security emerged. So this idea was that the bilateral relationship between Russia and the United States would be pretty stable as long as both sides knew that the other side would retaliate against a nuclear strike in a devastating way. So it's kind of the idea of mutually assured destruction, but put slightly more elegantly. Throughout the détente period and beyond, this approach, so this balance that came from strategic stability, helped to pave the way for cuts to the US nuclear arsenal and the Soviet nuclear arsenal, and it also continued to guide priorities in US nuclear posture. And we'll need to see, once the Trump administration releases its nuclear posture review, how much these kind of guiding principles continue to underline their stance. So the non-proliferation measures that we've already looked at today in this presentation have been pretty effective. And I think that's something that's really worth noting. But this doesn't mean that there aren't significant challenges. And given our time constraints, I've just pulled out a few of these, but I think the first one that I'd like to talk about is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. As many of you, I'm sure, know, this was a deal that was concluded in July of 2015 between the P5, so the nuclear weapon states, and Germany. It places limits on Iran's nuclear program, and it provides unprecedented access to the IAEA and to IAEA inspectors to verify Iran's compliance with its provisions. Now, under US law, our president has to certify that Iran is upholding its end of the deal. And Trump, as you may know recently, because this is an issue that's been developing in the news in the past few days, refused to do this in October of 2017, which punted the issue to Congress. So they now need to decide whether to reinstitute sanctions against Iran because they don't believe Iran is compliant, or whether they will not do this. Everyone with whom I've spoken, by and large, agrees that if Congress is to reinstitute the sanctions on Iran that predated the deal, that this would sort of precipitate its collapse. And so, from my standpoint, I think this would have significant practical implications. The deal has done a great job in terms of limiting Iran's breakout capability, but I think it would also have significant symbolic implications. If you're North Korea and you're looking at the United States and you see that we are not willing to uphold our end of a nuclear bargain, how does that change your negotiating posture? My guess would be for the negative. So the second challenge is one I've alluded to previously. It's the challenge in US-Russia relations. I think the crisis in relations that we see today really threatens the future of arms control and engagement between the two countries on nuclear issues. And this is a huge problem since, as we saw on the first slide, they're the possessors of the two largest nuclear arsenals globally. We do have the New START Treaty, which was concluded between the United States and Russia to cap numbers of weapons, but this treaty is going to expire in 2021 unless it's extended. We also have allegations of INF treaty violations that are swirling on both sides, and restarting relations, I think, will be very difficult amidst investigations into Russian meddling in the US election, as well as the Crimea crisis and the war in Syria. So what could this possibly mean for the maintenance of strategic stability? That's an issue that's worth contemplating. And last, but very, very much not least, we have the challenge of the DPRK and the North Korean nuclear weapons program. The development of North Korea's nuclear program, as well as attention to it, I think we can agree has ratcheted up significantly in the past year, and it really continues to develop daily. All of the experts with whom I have spoken, and I think those with whom I have not spoken as well, agree that a diplomatic solution is absolutely necessary to resolve this issue. A military solution such as a limited nuclear strike, it would be disastrous. Nevertheless, these tit-for-tat exchanges that we see between Pyongyang and Washington, D.C. increase the likelihood of a nuclear exchange either on purpose or by mistake. And I think the way that we're seeing this issue play out in the media, on Twitter, on the 24-hour news cycle, really highlights the potential consequences of unrestricted first use. So, in keeping with my tasking for my presentation, I'd now like to spend one slide just kind of bringing this conversation back to the issue of restricting first use. As I've tried to underscore here, we're in an environment where the prospects for miscalculation, misunderstanding, and miscommunication are high. And we saw a very vivid example of that just this morning. So I think we can all appreciate the type of heightened tension that we're in right now and the implications that that can have for our security. So in this environment, we, as scholars, but also as citizens, need to be looking at ways to lower tensions and to effectively manage non-proliferation challenges while reducing the risk of nuclear exchange. There are several ways that restricting first use, I think, would contribute to these efforts. First, I argue that it would constitute a contribution to the Non-Proliferation Treaty objectives. So you'll remember that states parties pledged to move towards disarmament. They also pledged to do things like reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national defense doctrines and reduce the operational readiness of their weapons. I think restricting first use could also contribute to reducing tensions with Russia, and it could help with the maintenance of this key notion of strategic stability that has really been one of the linchpins of our ability to cut our nuclear arsenal. I think it could also pave the way for greater cuts to the US nuclear arsenal unilaterally, as well as savings by reducing the need for forward deployed nuclear weapons in third countries and also the ground-based missile component of our nuclear triad. And last but not least, I think it could help to limit proliferation by changing the threat perception of non-nuclear weapon states who are worried about the potential for a US nuclear attack. So if you take a step back from that, this could change the way that countries perceive the threat posed by the United States. So these are my bottom lines. This is my final slide. There are a lot of nuclear weapons today, but there sure used to be a lot more. There are a lot of opportunities to limit their spread further, including by limiting first use, which is what we're going to be discussing as we move further in this panel. But there are also major challenges to this idea, and there are also major challenges to the non-proliferation regime that require nuanced and tailored approaches. I think it's worth thinking about how domestic and international politics can impact prospects for non-proliferation and disarmament. And with that, I'm going to leave it here, but I'd be delighted to answer your questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to roam with this to the crowd, and I'm also going to leave a microphone on the table here in case any questions are directed at any of you here. And lastly, I forgot to do one thing. I was kind of shaking still from this morning. I forgot to introduce our political friends who are here with us. We have with us Cecilia Aguilar Curry, the assemblywoman from our area. And we have over here Supervisor Don Saylor. And I saw some former electeds. Of course, we have former Assemblywoman Mariko Yamada, former Supervisor Betsy Marchand, Former Mayor of the City of Davis, Ken Wagstaff. Former School Board Member Marty West. And we will soon be joined by Congressman John Garamendi, who is en route right now. And first question.
Okay, I guess I'm the only non-politician here. When we talk about first use, we shouldn't think only about ICBMs and bombers. We should think about battlefield use, because this is one, or also Navy use, like ship to ship. So a lot of the tension between the US and Russia has to do with the fact that when Vladimir Putin goes to his western border, NATO's right over there. And there's war games going on both sides. And if the war games turn into real war, or any kind of shooting war, a general or a commander in the field might be tempted to use a so-called tactical nuclear weapon, and that would begin a cascade of nuclear weapon use. And so one thing I don't know is, do commanders in the field, supposedly the president is the only person who can order the use of a nuclear weapon, but I'm not sure that's really true. Is it possible that a commander in the field could decide, oh my God, look at all these Russians coming this way, let's use a tactical weapon?
So I'll say just at the outset that nuclear command and control is not something that I've focused on specifically in my own policy research. I think your point is well taken, though, which is that when you sort of reduce the potential lethality of a nuclear weapon, if we can even talk about that, by making it smaller, you increase the likelihood that it will be used. It's one thing to contemplate killing millions of people, but if you think, you know, it might only kill X number, and it's a smaller number, sure, I mean, that's still horrible, but it can lower the threshold to use, and that can then lead to an escalation of a greater nuclear exchange. So, you know, I think regardless of who is making those decisions, you're absolutely right that low-yield tactical nuclear weapons increase the temptation and the likelihood to use them. And fortunately, we've not had, you know, a nuclear exchange in our history, so we don't know exactly how people would behave in a situation like you described, where you see an oncoming threat and you have a tactical nuclear weapon at your disposal. It's my understanding that you cannot use a nuclear weapon under any circumstances without presidential authorization, but again, you know, that might be a question best addressed to someone who focuses on command and control. Yeah, thank you.
Over here's another question.
Thank you. As I understand it, South Africa was the first nation to disarm completely, to abolish their nuclear weapons. And Bishop Tutu once said of apartheid, we don't want our chains made more comfortable, we want them removed. To what extent does the Middlebury Institute support complete nuclear abolition, including here in the United States?
So we're a nonpartisan organization, and so I am not going to give a sort of assessment of the viewpoint of the Middlebury Institute as a whole. It's a very diverse organization full of different researchers who focus on different types of issues. You know, if you want my personal opinion, I do think that obviously the world will be a better and safer place if there are not nuclear weapons. I think personally I would support the idea that that needs to be accomplished in a fashion that doesn't create further instability. And you know, we can talk in our discussion period about what exactly that looks like, but I think that would be how I'd answer that question.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Dick Youngfleisch, and I'm from Fairfield. As I understand this issue, we have a nuclear-powered Navy, and the fuel rods for the nuclear-powered ships are highly enriched, actually weapon-grade uranium. So there's a legitimate use for that. In trying to have people disarm, can you envision, or do you address this issue of verification? You may have enriched uranium for a legal purpose, but it could be transferred back and forth between that and a weapon. I hope you can address that, but have you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, the IAEA has special provisions for the kind of fissile material you're describing that's used in naval propulsion. So it's certainly, you know, an issue that officials and official policy in this space addresses. I think you're exactly right, though, that there is always a concern that what we could call dual-use material, so material that could be used for both military and peaceful purposes, can be transferred from country to country. And there are many, many export controls in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. But it's, you know, as I think awareness has grown about the potential for, say, nuclear terrorism or that sort of thing, there are great concerns about where caches of fissile material are located and whether they're being secured effectively, whether they're being used for military purposes or civilian purposes. The same question and the same point, I think, applies to research reactors, many of which are fueled with highly enriched uranium. So there have been efforts to convert that fuel into low enriched uranium or to different fuel sources that can still be used for the same purposes but don't have the proliferation potential that you described.
Any other questions? Out here? Okay, Sarah, thank you very much. And now Mr. Bill Julian will introduce Professor John Sims.
I want to thank you all for being here. I have the honor.
Bill.
I have the honor of introducing Professor John Kerry Sims from McGeorge University. Professor Sims has a 40-year career of litigating and teaching public interest law that has focused on the U.S. Constitution in a variety of settings. He was first admitted to the bar in 1974, and after clerking for a distinguished judge in the First Circuit, he went to work for Public Citizen, Ralph Nader's litigation group, where he litigated for about 11 years before coming out to McGeorge to teach constitutional law. While at McGeorge, in the national crisis that followed the 9/11 attacks, Professor Sims joined with other professors from around the country to found the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, which quickly established itself as one of the most influential journals addressing the excruciatingly difficult issues raised by national security, foreign policy, armed conflict, human rights, surveillance, privacy, and counterterrorism. He is a recognized expert in constitutional law and in national security law. He's litigated, he's taught, and we're very pleased to have him here to educate us. Professor Sims.
Thanks very much, Bill. I actually feel I'm the one who's being educated. I've been helping some students who are preparing to do one of the competitions that's held around the country. This is the Jessup International Law Competition, and this year it actually has a large component of non-proliferation issues. So I'm thinking to myself, I've got to make sure that my students get that packet of materials, and then I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if we can get Sarah to, if her presentation, well, I guess it is being live streamed, so I can make sure that they watch it, because this is exactly what they need for their preparation. So I'm really very honored and happy to be here. It's just always terrific to find, no matter what else is going on in our country, around the world, that there are lots and lots of people who really care about the law, both domestically and internationally, and really care about the risks that we face and are really working together to try to move towards solutions. And so it's just, I can't tell you how exciting it is to go and see people that really care about it, and to be here and be able to talk to you. So I just can't think of anything I'd rather be doing this afternoon. And so my role here is to be a resource in terms of the constitutional context in which these issues about H.R. 669 would be discussed. And, you know, and I mean, Sarah has already discussed many issues of constitutional law that are really embedded into any discussion of these problems. So, for example, the treaty process, you know, how the U.S. makes treaties, how we become a party to a treaty. And even those oblique aspects of that came up in Sarah's presentation make one point really clear. It's really hard for the U.S. to become a party to a treaty because of the procedures that are followed in the Senate, and then ultimately, unlike most other aspects of our policymaking process, you need a 2/3 approval vote in the Senate. And so, like, for example, the Law of the Sea Convention, there's almost universal support for, but there's some little clique in the Senate that has always been able to stop that from getting adopted. You know, if it could actually get to a vote, I think there'd be far more than 2/3 in the Senate that would support it. And this is, you know, Republican and Democratic administrations both support it, and it's gotten through the committee a couple times, never actually gotten voted on. And we're talking decades of delay in which the mining companies who want to engage in the exploitation of the seabed resources and our Navy, other navies, all our national security people, our trade people, everybody wants it, and yet it still gets hung up. So that's part of the reason that this treaty structure, it tends to have some antiquated pieces to it, and that changing it is really difficult because you have to run that gauntlet to get anything adopted as a treaty. And that's part of it. And then I'm going to focus a little more on the case law and some of the statutory law that would bear upon these issues. And you'll see it's a pretty untidy package. And I just will touch upon some of the aspects of it that seem most likely to be useful today, and then I can tell already we'll have a lot of questions and a lot of discussion. Before I get into it, I'm going to, if you'll forgive me, I want to talk about a case that has nothing at all to do with what we're talking about today. But I would say this would illustrate a more conventional sort of development of constitutional law. Because I'm going to make the point that the constitutional law and the constitutional discussion that would surround H.R. 669 is not at all typical. So here's a typical case, a case called Packingham against North Carolina, which the Supreme Court decided on June 19th of 2017. North Carolina had a statute that said that if you're a registered sex offender, you couldn't use most of the most popular aspects of social media, Facebook, for example. And I guess the idea was that if you're a proven sex offender, you might be more likely than others to use social media to recruit new victims or to identify potential victims or to establish contact with them. And of course, we're always reading about these stings in which, yeah, that's exactly what happens, except in the ones we read about, it's a law enforcement officer rather than a 12-year-old girl who's on the other end of the internet connection. But anyway, so Packingham is a registered sex offender. He is under this prohibition, and it's a crime. It's a felony in North Carolina if you use Facebook or establish certain other web presences that as somebody who's in his situation. So he says, well, you can't do that, and he challenges it. He says, this violates the First Amendment. You know, yeah, there's some kind of a justification for trying to keep people like me off the internet, but this goes way too far. And ultimately, the Supreme Court agreed. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion, and what he says, which ultimately is really important for lots of other contexts that don't have anything to do with sex offenses, he basically says that, well, in our modern world, we used to fight about who could speak in the public parks or who could have a demonstration on the street, but he says now the vast democratic forums of the internet are one of the most important places for the exchange of ideas. And therefore, to totally exclude somebody from that, based even on a criminal conviction, was impermissible. Obviously, there probably are and will be much more targeted statutes that will prevent abuses of the internet for purposes like a sex offender might be interested in, but that particular statute fell. So you have a nice crisp process. There's a statute, it says it's a crime to do this, he does it and says you can't punish me because that statute violates the First Amendment, and ultimately the Supreme Court says, yeah, the defendant is right. The First Amendment does invalidate that conviction because the statute, as it's written, violates the First Amendment. Now, that's the typical constitutional law case, or at least a not untypical constitutional law case. Now we move into the context of U.S. nuclear policy and command and control and the non-proliferation regime and the control over U.S. nuclear weapons and the possibility of a statute like 669 that would say no first strike unless there's a declaration of war by Congress. And now all of a sudden, we're in a completely different constitutional world. Where it's very murky. It's, in many ways, not likely to end up in court. It's very unlikely to yield nice, clear answers, like the sort of answer that got generated in the Buckingham case. And that doesn't mean it's not worth discussing, because as I'll explain, I do think it's really important to discuss these issues. Not only in terms of the policy issues and the lawmaking issues and the political issues, but also in terms of the constitutional law. But you just have to have realistic expectations of where it's going to lead and what answers you might, in your most optimistic frame of mind, hope for. Because there are a lot of aspects of our system. Many of them are really great elements in other contexts, but in this context, it really blunts the effectiveness of constitutional interpretation and certainly constitutional litigation, just because of the limited capacity of our institutions to deal with certain kinds of problems. And I'll mention there have been really important aspects of national security and of war and peace and foreign relations that have ultimately been resolved by the courts as an aspect of their interpretation of constitutional law, but that's not the norm. And in some ways, there are a few pieces of low-hanging fruit that the courts have been able to deal with, and this issue about if there's a nuclear crisis that might possibly lead a president of the United States to believe that the first use of nuclear weapons is an appropriate course of action to defend the United States, well, I don't think that's likely to be a low-hanging fruit situation. It's likely to be extremely complicated. And of course, as we know from the invasion of Iraq in 2003, just ascertaining the facts, it can be very difficult. The U.S. launched the attack on Iraq with many of the participants in our political system, not everybody, but many of them, having made the judgment that Iraq had a robust and ongoing program of developing weapons of mass destruction. It turned out to be totally wrong. And we're still trying to deal with the consequences of that. So therefore, whatever we imagine is happening as there's this debate and this imaginary, almost unimaginable in terms of the details of it, future situation in which a president might contemplate a first use of nuclear weapons, even then the question will be, well, like, what is true and what isn't? Who's saying what? How do we know? At what level of certainty? What are the predictions that we can make about the consequences of certain acts? It's going to be very difficult. But so having warned you about the caution with which you want to approach your constitutional contemplation of the kinds of issues that are dealt with in H.R. 669, let me just set the background. a little bit in terms of the constitutional text. Now, I did bring in a very short handout, just 3 pages, and I made some copies. I left them back there. If we run out of copies, anybody wants a copy, you could just send me an email, and I'd be happy to just send you a PDF of it. My email is really easy. I should have put it on something, but it's just jsims, JSIMS, @pacific.edu. And so if you don't get one of those handouts you want it, just let me know. But at the Constitutional Convention, there was almost no discussion that's very relevant here. Of course, there are these big multi-volume compilations of the history of the debate at the Constitutional Convention, obviously on things like slavery and taxation and the regulation of trade and the relationships among the states and how the legislature would be organized. There was immense ongoing discussions. Here, I've given you the one little paragraph that's one page body of discussion that's relevant in that, of course, it's partly in the context that the framers were really concerned about whether there should even be a standing army. Because, having had our experience with England, we were quite conscious that professional soldiers, as opposed to the militia, could really be an instrument of oppression. And that having a standing army could enable the sorts of coups that we know are quite common in many countries. On the other hand, if you rely entirely on militias, your ability to respond quickly to a crisis and your ability to, say, if you have to fight the British Empire or France or Spain, it wasn't entirely clear that the militias would be enough. And there was that, but there was really serious talk about putting a numerical limit in the Constitution on the size of a standing army in order to prevent oppression and risk of this sort of misdirection of the resources of the country to oppress rather than to defend. And that was rejected. But there are some provisions that really emphasize the role of Congress in exercising the power of the purse to control the size of the military, to give that special budgetary power, the initiation of it to the House, which should be more connected to the people, put time limits on how long the appropriations could go, and to really emphasize it. There is, of course, the language that talks about the power of Congress to declare war, which is essential in analyzing the statute that brings us here today. And that language had started out saying something totally different, and that's what this little excerpt that I provided says, because initially the proposal was that Congress would have the power to make war. And that, of course, led to the fairly obvious rejoinder, wait, the legislature is too slow to conduct the operations in the field. If we're depending on Congress to make war, we're in big trouble. On the other hand, having the president able to unilaterally declare war or make war would be extremely perilous and dangerous. And so they amended the language to take us where we are now, which it says that the Congress has the power to declare war, and it was accepted that the tactical decisions, the actual conduct of operations, would be carried out by the president. And of course, the language in Article 2 of the Constitution says the president is the commander-in-chief. That setup also really just has this one phrase in the debate among the delegates at the convention on this that gets to the heart of the matter, because Congress would declare war, but the president would retain the power to repel sudden attacks. That there might be circumstances in which use of force would be necessary, when, of course, especially in the old days, Congress wouldn't even be in session that much. It'd only be in session a couple months at a time. Even if they were there, they might not be able to collaborate very effectively to resolve the issue. And of course, what's so obvious as we listen to what Sarah has to say, that in the modern context, with intercontinental ballistic missiles and the devastating power of nuclear weapons, and the number of nuclear weapons, and the number of different actors who potentially have access to nuclear weapons or control over nuclear weapons, somehow, all of a sudden, that peril from a sudden attack is a lot different than it was back when the framers set up this system. Because now, the apprehension that a sudden attack might be the end is very much on the mind of policymakers, and then they're trying to come up with an appropriate response. And our response has been, well, that the president can respond to an attack on the United States that's of a certain character by launching a devastating nuclear attack at what he thinks is the instigator of the attack. And and that's what sets up our problem. Of course, the subset that we're specifically worried about is first strike, but the bigger issue is nuclear strike at all. And if you get some warning that says, well, the 400 missiles from China or from Russia or from someplace else are going to land in 12 minutes, Congress is not going to meet. So we don't like it. We find it extremely disturbing to contemplate, any exchange of that sort. And of course, partly because inevitably nuclear weapons, even the more limited and more precisely directed modern nuclear weapons, which aren't going to be the 20 megaton bombs that are going to wipe out a city, and they're going to be, some multi-warheaded missile that's going to send smaller missiles that are mostly going to be aimed at military targets or the missiles on the other side, but obviously millions or hundreds of millions or billions of people are going to get killed. And many of them are going to be civilians. They're not even going to be, in any stretch of the imagination, military force members. But that's been the situation ever since the U.S. woke up that morning and learned it wasn't the only nuclear power anymore. When we were shocked when the USSR tested its first nuclear weapon. But we've lived with that. But then the general problem of this hair trigger nuclear capacity that can really destroy the world, with the concentration of that power in potentially one person, with the possibility that it would be a first strike, all those concerns come together, and that's what we're talking about in this statute. But it's, this is one aspect of an immense problem that goes way beyond the first strike issue. Because, the whole idea of nuclear deterrence and the threat to respond to an attack on our country by killing hundreds of millions of people is a very disturbing possibility, even if we are attacked, and it's not a first strike. But the first strike problem is unique, because the other aspects of it are to some extent unavoidable, whereas a first strike, I guess by definition, is avoidable. It's not a nuclear war yet until somebody decides that it is and takes action. Let me just mention, the constitutional boundaries. Article 1 gives Congress its powers. So Congress has really broad powers, and in this regard especially, the exclusive power to declare war, maintains the Army and the Navy. It's got the power of the purse, which of course is really important, especially in building up the force, developing the force, and now we're talking about modernizing the nuclear force, but then also any sustained conflict like the Vietnam War or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, continuing to support it becomes a huge issue. Article 2 gives the president powers. Of course, commander-in-chief also carries out the foreign relations of the U.S., so negotiating all the treaties would be the president's responsibility, although ultimately then formalizing any agreement reached in the form of a treaty would involve the two-thirds vote in the Senate that I mentioned. Lastly, there's sort of this two-edged sword. The president has to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And so the president likes to emphasize that gives him the authority to carry out the laws, but of course it also constrains him that he has to comply with the laws. And then we have Article 3, which creates the federal courts. And we know, going all the way back to Marbury against Madison in 1803, that we have a very powerful judicial establishment that's independent. Those federal judges have life tenure, so they're not up for re-election. They can and sometimes do stand up to the president or stand up to Congress or stand up to the states or stand up to any element within our system. But part of that is that they have limited authority. There are only certain kinds of cases that the federal courts can hear. And just in a general sort of way, I'll say that we bundle up these limitations under the idea of justiciability. That is this a matter that can be heard by a federal court? And the courts guard those boundaries pretty jealously and say, oh, we're not going to hear a case if there's not a plaintiff who has standing, who's entitled to bring the case. We're not going to get involved if it's a political question. We're not going to get involved if it isn't ripe yet. And that whole bundle of constraints has come to the fore a lot with regard to issues resembling those that we're talking about today. So that's one reason that I can tell you what the Constitution says, I can refer to a couple cases, but unlike in that First Amendment context where I could refer to 100 cases that had something to do with the problem, in foreign affairs and national security, if we talk about the top 3 or 4 cases, we're almost at the end of the list. So it just, there isn't that much to work with. And that's why any kind of prediction like, well, what would happen if we had a statute and then the president refused to comply with it? Would the courts say that that was a violation of the Constitution? It's hard to say on some of these. The history, here's the an additional problem. Because you don't have very many court cases, most of the debate on this sort of issue involves parties referring to historical episodes that they think confirm their point of view. And of course, those historical episodes, first of all, it's not all clear half the time what happened. And also, there's no adjudication. It's never been determined. The president did this. The Senate did that. The Navy did such and so. But nobody decided if it was legal. And so, I guess the idea is if you can accumulate a long enough series of episodes in which something happened, then you say, well, it must be legal because it's happened again and again and again. And occasionally the Supreme Court will pay some attention to that, but it's not a very precise way of analyzing a problem. And in any kind of issue like involving use of force, each side has its own favorite episodes that it wants to, we're talking about the Barbary pirates all the time, and the so-called quasi-war with France in 1798, and what happened with the Vietnam War. We're obviously still fighting about that, or Korea, and it just, and we look back at that history of unadjudicated, unresolved historical episodes, and we're trying to derive some sort of constitutional law from that. I will say there are a couple things I'll just flag here. I got to stop. One is that, like in the Civil War, President Lincoln imposed a blockade of the southern ports while Congress was out of session. The question was, well, did he have the authority to do that? And ultimately, the Supreme Court said yes. It's called the prize cases because those ships had been taken as prizes. But ultimately, by the time the Supreme Court got involved in the case, Congress had already come back into session and they'd said it was okay. So that's a typical example. Yeah, there's sort of a lesson there, but it's hard to figure out what it is. There was, of course, the Korean War. President Truman launched the U.S. military mission under the auspices of the UN in support of South Korea without any declaration of war and without any action of any sort from Congress. Again, Congress was not in session. And then when Congress came back, they obviously knew what was going on. He never asked them for authority. They never gave him authority. We just went ahead and waged the war in Korea. The one precedent that comes out of the Korean War that we talk about all the time is it's so famous it even has a nickname. It's Youngstown sheet and tube against Young, but we always call it the steel seizure case, because in the middle of the Korean War, there was going to be a strike that was going to affect the whole steel production in the country, and President Truman, not physically, but with a stroke of the pen, took control of the steel mills and said basically they're being operated by the United States now. And that way he could raise the wages and prevent the strike. And the steel manufacturers, they can hire lots of lawyers. They went to court and they said to the president, you can't do that. And ultimately the Supreme Court said yes. You're right. The president, even though it's in the middle of a war, even though the president says he needs the steel, he can't do this. And there's this famous, if you look at this analysis from the Congressional Research Service, there's this famous analysis it's great in terms of the structure, but it doesn't really answer most of the questions for us, where Justice Jackson, even though he didn't write the opinion for the court, he wrote his own concurring opinion just for himself, and he says, well, the way you really have to look at one of these problems is, because we've got both the congressional authority to declare war and the power of the purse and various other powers involved, and we've got the presidential powers, commander-in-chief, and the diplomatic control. What you really have to do in one of these situations is look, has Congress acted in the area? And so if you have the president doing something that Congress has authorized, it's not always going to be constitutional, but it's got a really pretty good bet that it's going to be upheld. And on the other hand, if the president is doing something that Congress has forbidden, that is in the area where the president's power is at its lowest ebb. And so it's very unlikely that the president is going to be able to go ahead. And there have been a few cases where the president's been able to say, that statute that binds me is illegal. But that's pretty rare. And then we have this untidy twilight zone described by Justice Jackson where Congress hasn't really spoken, and the court has to try and figure it out just on the basis of the powers of the various parties. But it's under that regime that the court did say that Truman had improperly taken control of the steel mills and ordered him to return control, which he did. He complied with that. And then, so you could see that having a statute certainly dramatically affects how you do the analysis under this Jackson opinion in the steel seizure case. And then let me mention one other thing, and then I'll stop, which is we do have a statute that obviously is very much on our minds as we look at this proposal, and that is the War Powers Resolution. So, of course, there was never a declaration of war in Vietnam. There was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that apparently was based on a complete misunderstanding of the facts of what had actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin in August of 1964, but President Johnson got what he wanted. He got a resolution that he could treat as a blank check to do what he wanted to do in Vietnam. But of course, Congress was not blameless either, because they were duped in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but then in the succeeding 10 years, they proceeded to appropriate the money for all the military activity, to have all kinds of hearings and be cheerleaders for most of the war effort, and of course pass the draft statutes and provide for vigorous enforcement of the draft statutes in order to provide the young men to be sent to Vietnam. So, but what that led to, as the Vietnam War is becoming obviously an unsuccessful venture, Congress is trying to kind of rewrite history a little bit and say, well, it wasn't our fault. We were just misled. It was just those tiny steps those 1,000 tiny steps that we took, it wasn't really our fault, it's all the executive's fault, and we want to stop that. So the War Powers Resolution basically says Congress is, kind of reasserting and firming up its traditional role in making the decision about whether to go to war. And so what it provides is that if armed forces are used by the president, that Congress has to either declare war or give a statutory authorization for continuing the military activities, or the president has to withdraw the troops. And it can be made to 90 days under some circumstances. But the basic idea is to sort of respect that idea of repelling sudden attacks. And in fact, it might even be that the president isn't exactly, repelling an attack, but it does allow a certain degree of executive initiative and executive decision subject to congressional re-examination closely. All I can tell you is the statute has not really worked very well. Because first of all, the courts almost refuse to hear them at all, and a lot of the definitions are really pretty vague. So for example, when President Obama supported the NATO attacks on Libya to get Gaddafi out, Congress never approved that in any way. So the president kind of goes ahead and does what he wants to for 60 days, and then he pulls back and says, well, U.S. isn't actually going to conduct any more raids on Libya. We'll just have our AWACS direct the attacks by the French and UK planes, and therefore 60 days is up, and I don't need to worry about getting any approval from Congress. But of course, Congress sort of, again, went along. So that statute shows it is possible to have a statute that tries to deal with these issues, and it's certainly well-meaning, and it's got a lot of good aspects to it, but it's not, at least as far as judicial enforcement, it's been totally unsuccessful. It has worked, and maybe that's how this statute, if it were adopted, would primarily affect things. It kind of affects the interaction of the parties and the negotiations. So for example, at one point, presidents have said, oh, the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. We can't be restricted by a statute like that. I think that's wrong. But again, it's never really been determined. But President Reagan had a lot of Marines in Beirut at one point, and it was alleged that they were engaged in enough of a hostile environment that the War Powers Resolution was triggered, and it would only be 60 days. And what that led to, the overhang of the War Powers Resolution led the president to negotiate with Congress, and they basically passed a special statute that provided for a deadline. I think it was 18 months for the withdrawal of those troops from Beirut, and then that was followed through on. So it wasn't the 60 days contemplated in the statute, but the existence of the statute affected the way things were done. And I'll just, one other point, which is that, the declaration of war language in here, I wouldn't place too much weight on that as opposed to statutes, because of course the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11, the authorization for the use of force in invading Iraq in the first Gulf War, they really took the form of a statute rather than a technical declaration of war. And even if this statute says you need a true declaration of war, not a statute that authorizes military action, a later statute can always change a prior statute. So that distinction I wouldn't get hung up on. The real question is what role is being played by Congress as opposed to the role that might be taken unilaterally by the president. Thanks.
Questions? Mr. Bruni, come right next. That's hot. Hold on. Come into your tent.
This is for Garamendi. On July 7, 2017, the United Nations adopted a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons by a vote of 122 to 1. The treaty opened for signing on September 20th and will go into effect when 50 nations ratify it. I would like you to sponsor legislation to order President Trump to sign it. Do I have your pledge to fight tooth and nail for
Well,
such
see there.
legislation?
And I think we have to amend Article 2 first. See, and if you don't mind, I'll mention one recent case which would bear on this. Because Article 2 specifically gives the president what it has to give him, which is the authority to conduct foreign relations with other countries. So the president accepts ambassadors, receives ambassadors from other countries, and obviously the president appoints ambassadors. You know, sometimes we saw the recent events in the Netherlands, sometimes the appointments don't work out all that well, but it's his call as to who he sends off to speak on his behalf. And the president has the sole power to recognize foreign states, to decide which is the legitimate government of a state if there's a dispute about that. And the president, has to have control over the Secretary of State. So the president could unquestionably remove the Secretary of State at any moment for no reason at all if the president lost confidence. And the Article 2, Section 2, which deals with, so this appointments power and the treaty power are all in Article 2, Section 2, and it says the president shall make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. So the president, that would be a core executive function that I think any effort, that's one of those situations where if there's a statute that said president has to make a certain agreement, I think that statute's unconstitutional. Because there was one of the cases that's cited in this study from Congressional Research Service all over the place is a case called Zivotofsky, which was decided only a couple years ago by the Supreme Court. So Congress, of course, has passed the bill saying that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And one of the other parts of the legislation that Congress had passed was saying that if you're an American citizen born in Jerusalem, you are entitled to have your passport say that you were born in Israel. And a number of presidents, up to and including President Obama, said, I am not going to follow that statute because that interferes with my appointment authority, my recognition power. Because whether Jerusalem is part of Israel is yet to be determined. That's what we're negotiating about. And so the president refused to comply with the statute, and the Supreme Court ultimately said he was right, that he didn't have to comply with that statute because we can put it into that system out of steel seizure, that there's a direct conflict between the statute and the president's conduct, but the statute in that particular case is unconstitutional because the president gets to make that call. And so on making the treaty, of course, here you got the other problem that if the law of the Sea Convention can't get through the Senate, even though everybody supports it, then even if you got to the stage of getting the treaty there with the president so the president would have to sign it on behalf of the U.S. Then it would go to the Senate. Then we have the requirement for getting through the Senate procedures, 2/3 vote in the Senate. Then it comes back to the president, and then the formal ratification is when the president sends it in. There's some record keeper on these treaties, whether it's at the UN or in Geneva or at The Hague. It keeps track. Okay, we need 40 states. That's 2, that's 3. And so it's only when they receive that package from the President of the United States that says, count us in, that we go on the list. So I'd love to see the U.S.'s position on nuclear proliferation change dramatically, but I don't think that's the mechanism, personally.
Mr. Bruni, I'm going to move to a couple more folks, and Congressman Garamendi is not here. This is Professor Sims up here right now. So I'll go here, and I got over here, and I got here, and I hear back here.
Well, Professor, thank you for your presentation. I've heard this criticism of the way the government is functioning, that the Congress, the legislature, has lost much of its power to the executive, the imperial presidency. It's gotten too easy to use military force. since in that regard, in the use of the now all-voluntary military force makes it even easier. So there's not a contingency within our public now that resents the use of it. If you place your sons and daughters in line of fire, you're much more circumspect about doing it. Do you feel that there's a sense within the Congress to take back this power away from the executive and restrict the use of military force much more than that's being done?
Well, I'm just saying that's what was attempted in the War Powers Resolution. And don't be misled. It says War Powers Resolution. It's actually a statute. And I think that was one of the areas where Congress was, wanted to kind of sugarcoat the pill a little bit. But there actually is a really wonderful long law review article called "What if Congress Wanted a War Powers Resolution That Really Worked?" And we could have a stack of law review articles that high on proposals to change. So the basic concept has been tried. It hasn't worked very well, and I think one of the issues you'd have to figure out is how to set it up so that there would be a way for courts to enforce it. And so it would take really strong attention to that. I mean, I should point out the War Powers Resolution was passed. It was very controversial when it was adopted, even in the last days of the Vietnam War, because I think the only reason it got through really was because President Nixon was so weak because of Watergate. So he was on the defensive with Watergate. He actually vetoed the War Powers Resolution when it was passed, saying this improperly intrudes on the powers of the presidency. But then at that particular moment, he was so weak that he could be overridden by 2/3 of the House and the Senate. So, but I think that it would using the experience of the War Powers Resolution, one I think could craft a statute that would do a much better job of regulating the use of force and making sure that the responsibility is not unilaterally exercised by the president, except in the most desperate situation. Whether there's the political will to do that, I suppose, is a good question. But I would say, as written, the War Powers Resolution had that objective of trying to make Congress a co-participant in the decisions about using force, but it hasn't worked that well. Because, of course, what the whole idea of the War Powers Resolution is, once you, as we've seen, once you get committed to a conflict, then Congress finds it very hard, maybe impossible, to say, oh, let's undo that, because then they're seen as being disloyal to the troops. They're not supporting the troops. So that initial decision to get in is much easier to make than a decision to get out. It's kind of like a ratchet. It only turns one direction, unfortunately.
Over here, and just so I'll remind folks, the congressman is going to be here about 5 minutes to 4. He's very close.
To what extent does the United States, under the Constitution, need to abide by international law, which seems to be quite clear about at least the immorality of any weapon of mass civilian destruction? And in light of the lawsuit even by the Marshall Islands after all the nuclear testing that they're trying to pursue with the Netherlands. But how does that function in terms of international law and American use of nuclear weapons?
Boy, that is an incredibly difficult and interesting question. Let me just pick up on one thing Sarah said and just tie it in. So we do have two sources of international law, primarily. One is treaties, where states, like we've agreed to the UN Charter, we've agreed to the Torture Convention and the Geneva Conventions and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there also is customary international law, which has the potential that if there's a broad enough consensus among the states in the world community on something, and they see that there's a legal obligation there, then that becomes binding even if you're not a party to the treaty. So those two processes are both working and are really important. Unfortunately, the history of the U.S., especially I would say in recent years, on respecting international law has not been good. So there's a dramatic case called Medellin where there's a treaty under which all the states' parties were supposed to notify any non-national of their state who was taken into custody, typically he or she has a right to communicate with their consulate. So there were more than 50 Mexican nationals on U.S. death rows all across the country, and none of them had been notified that they were entitled to be in touch with the Mexican consulate, which could have helped them make sure they got good legal representation. Maybe they need records from home. Of course, in a lot of cases, the childhood medical traumas or treatment is related, especially to get to the penalty phase of a death penalty case. So the International Court of Justice at The Hague said the U.S. was in violation of its obligations and that there should be further hearings. President Bush was in at that point. I'd have to say he wasn't totally committed to the idea that Texas, in the Medellin case, actually ought to give more hearings before Medellin was executed. So he didn't, there was no legislation, there was no real effort, so he just sent a memo to the Attorney General saying, oh, the way we're going to comply with the ICJ judgment is by having the states carry out the hearings. And Texas says, you can't make us. You can't make us give more hearings to this guy because we already did everything that it's called for under our law. Case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, it may be true that the U.S. is in violation of its international law obligations, but in the context of this case anyway, there's no way to enforce that obligation. So Medellin was ultimately executed, even though the ICJ had ruled that the U.S. had violated the relevant treaty in terms of his treatment. So and I would say Chief Justice Roberts has written a number of these opinions, and I would say his attitude toward international law is not very congenial in general. And so at a point, up to a point, it's true that our own constitutional processes determine what happens within our system, and that, if we're in violation of international law, that goes to other forums. Of course, UN Security Council can't do anything because we have a veto there. ICJ may not have jurisdiction. So in fact, the treaty that allowed jurisdiction in the case that led up to Medellin, first thing President Bush did, I guess, was send this little postcard to the Attorney General saying, oh, we're going to have the states do what they should do, but they won't do. And then the second thing was, oh, we're going to withdraw from that treaty that gave jurisdiction to the ICJ in this kind of case, guaranteeing that there won't be any more cases like that. And that's an example where the president has the authority to withdraw from treaties unilaterally. It was originally the case where President Carter withdrew from the defense treaty with Taiwan in order to allow us to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC. So in that context, seemed like a pretty good idea, but it does mean that generally speaking, the president can withdraw from treaties. That's one of those justiciability issues because, in effect, the Supreme Court has said, Constitution doesn't say how we withdraw from treaties, so therefore, if the president withdraws from a treaty, the federal courts don't have any power to tell him that he can't do it. Therefore, the president, with no real ruling on the merits, president goes ahead, withdraws from a treaty, and there was one of these, that's the nuclear, the anti-missile, the ballistic missile test treaty. The U.S. withdrew from unilaterally. Again, President Bush just decided to withdraw from it, and he could do that. He couldn't be stopped. So that creates a real, in some respects, some justices on the Supreme Court have been much more attentive to international law, but cited international laws for making rulings on domestic law, and for example, abolishing the death penalty for those that are mentally disabled, abolishing the death penalty for juvenile offenders, and actually protecting gay rights, recognizing that international law was way ahead of us and that we ought to try and catch up a little bit.
Over here.
Okay, so my question is really for the congressman, but you can provide the right introduction by covering your area of expertise, and it's about whether a ban on first use by Congress, whatever, would be constitutional, or there's some problem that we can't take that away from his ability to make war powers. Because I actually believe that, good as this resolution is, a better one would be no first use. We don't need Congress in there. This is U.S. policy, no first use. Politically, I think that would be better in terms of getting people clear that, as Daniel Ellsberg said recently on the radio, a tactical nuclear weapon is not going to stay tactical if we use it first. But my question, and I really don't know the answer, it could be short or long, is can the Congress bind the commander-in-chief's power this way?
My instinct is yes, but as I've already indicated, it's more an issue of, I think, a very strong statement of a policy like that by Congress would set up a public discussion and even an internal operation within the government that we would hope would advance that goal. But if the idea is that anybody would ever get an injunction against the president that would say you're not allowed to launch a first strike, there our whole history makes that very dubious, because of course we wouldn't know enough about the controversy. It would be said, oh, the controversy isn't ripe yet, or it's a political question, because see, the courts would say, how can we decide that? We don't know the facts of what's going on, and that's why almost all the war powers resolution cases have washed out on some sort of a justiciability problem. It's moot, that is that it's over, it's not ripe yet, there's no standing, or it's a political question.
Right, but the problem for me when I first read this in the enterprise thing was, okay, what does it mean for Congress when the president doesn't have this power, and then in the midst of a crisis, the Congress says, yeah, you got it now. Seems to me that really advances the threat level and the possibility, oh, well, let's not do response, let's preempt.
Well, yeah, I mean, historically, Congress has shown a great willingness to raise the threat level, and so generally, if that's what the president's asking for, Congress is applauding and kind of elbowing each other out of the way to get to the front of the line. I mean, certainly that was the experience in Vietnam, and in large measure the war on Iraq in 2003. So, I mean, obviously any kind of interaction we imagine is going to be very specific to a particular context. And this is one of the big challenges of constitutional law generally. You have to figure out what you think the constitutional law principles are without knowing who's president. You have to have principles that you're willing to accept no matter who is president, or no matter who it is who's in the Senate, or who it is who's in the House, or who it is that's on the Supreme Court. And that's really hard. And that's why our tradition of having these written opinions where things kind of build on each other over the decades and over the centuries, where the court feels a need to put whatever its current thinking is in the context of the prior decisions, that obviously doesn't depoliticize the process, but it helps keep it on track. But of course, one component of that is that the court will say, in the super politicized situations, we can't get involved in that. But on the other hand, they did decide that President Truman had acted improperly in seizing the steel mills. There was an executive agreement, that is a non-treaty international agreement that was made to end the Iran hostage crisis, where the U.S. basically got the hostages back, and we agreed to send billions of dollars to a fund at The Hague that was going to pay claims by U.S. companies, and the Supreme Court decided that case. They ultimately decided that that agreement was okay. So they will get involved, but they're very cautious. But when they do get involved, there's a certain predictability and a certain legitimacy to it, because they're forced to explain why they're doing. And so with the Guantanamo detainees, the Supreme Court consistently rejected the policies that had been followed by the Bush administration, even though that was not easy to do, and there was a lot of controversy surrounding it, but they basically forced there to be hearings for the people at Guantanamo, even though the administration took them to Guantanamo in the first place because they didn't think that the courts would get involved, because it's part of Cuba, not part of the United States. But the Supreme Court said that won't work.
Thanks very much for the talk. I have a little bit of a different kind of a question, and I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer it, or it may even be that Sarah may have something to say about it. But recently there's been obviously a lot of discussion about President Trump and whether he might launch a first strike against against North Korea. And there's been discussions about whether some of the military people under him might fail to follow through on that. There have been congressional hearings, including one at which a military leader said that they wouldn't follow any illegal orders to do a first strike. And as we know, in the past, there have been a few individual people who basically have averted nuclear war on the basis of their decisions not to follow through with certain things. So my question is, you've basically been speaking to the sort of constitutional utility of a law like H.R. 669, but I wonder whether there's another kind of utility that might be present, that if this kind of a law were in place, regardless of how it played out at a constitutional level, would it be worthwhile from the sense of individuals in the military saying, I'm not going to follow that, there's a law against doing that at this time, and thereby averting sort of an immediate threat, regardless of what happens later on in the constitutional follow-through on that?
Oh, I think so. That's a really good point, and I think I would agree with it completely. And I think that would be true for all those involved in the process. You know, I mean, at all levels. I mean, plainly, we don't expect people in a hierarchical structure to decide all the time, or usually for themselves, what they're going to do. You know, that's why it's a command structure. On the other hand, there is an obligation, certainly in the war crimes situation. Think about My Lai or lots of other situations, that you can't follow an order that you know is wrong and is illegal. And I was reading up on thinking along these lines. Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, during the waning days of the Nixon administration. So, Supreme Court has ruled the tapes have to be turned over. President Nixon's not in that great a shape. It's not immediately clear whether he's going to comply with the order. And Secretary Schlesinger told the military commanders, if you get a military order from President Nixon, don't implement it unless you get the okay from either me or the other peace protector, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. But there was a recognition that some sort of a circuit breaker there was called for under the circumstances. Now that wasn't written down anywhere, but it was obviously driven by Schlesinger's concern that Nixon might give an illegal order. And in making that determination, I think whatever the statutes are, whatever the procedures are that set up the responsibilities, I think we have to assume that everybody involved will generally try to do their best to comply. And that gives us some guarantee. If there's one individual who, due to mental incapacity or ill will or evil tendencies, whatever it is, tries to deviate, then others will hem that in. We hope so. So therefore, having a statute that says what the U.S. policy is a really good thing, even if we don't think it might not get enforced by the courts.
I'm going to take a few more questions. Got one right here. And I recognize all who have raised their hands. And before that, Sarah, did you want to weigh in on that?
This isn't supposed to be a filibuster. We didn't want to get into the Senate procedure that much. Sarah, really, get up here.
Okay, my name is Harry Wong. I'm the president of the Sacramento chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility. I want to really show appreciation for having this teach-in today. So this question actually is more for Sarah, so good timing. And I'm just wondering, what you can say about what the Nuclear Posture Review says about first strike use and how much weight that has versus the, quote, rights or responsibilities of either Congress or the president in terms of what the nuclear posture states and how it might change.
So I have a very easy answer to that question, which is that we've only seen portions of that document, and they have been leaked portions. So the document itself has not been released, and we'll need to wait and see what actually comes out in that particular document. You know, you can go online and read analyses of what the leaks have said so far, but just as a word of caution, you should know that until you get an official document, I wouldn't put too much credence into the things that you see on the internet, but it will be very interesting to see what that looks like. And just apropos of some of the conversations that you've been having answering these questions, you know, President Obama did contemplate initiating a no first use policy. And that was something that, as you, I think, aptly described, came from the top, and then there were discussions within the kind of security community and the military community about how that could be implemented. And obviously that didn't come to pass, but it's a very different procedure when you have a leadership that is interested in implementing that type of policy versus the kind of conversation we're talking about here, which is really about limiting the ability of the folks at the top to make those kinds of decisions.
I'd like to get off of war for one quick question about the Constitution. Do you believe the balanced budget amendment, 26 states have already passed the desire to have a balanced budget amendment. We only need 6 more. So much in Congress, as both of you have been explaining, can't be resolved because there's no constitutional words that literally give you the answer. Where do you stand? We can't put in a constitutional amendment about war. What about balancing the budget? It just can't be done. It started in 1974, I think, with a congressional act to balance the budget, and it still hasn't come to pass.
Well, I mean, amending the Constitution is really difficult. You know, there's only been 4 times in all of history where the amendment process has been used to undo a decision from the Supreme Court, even though, of course, every time there's an unpopular decision that comes out about flag burning or parent schools or whatever, there's an immediate, oh, let's amend the Constitution. It doesn't happen because you need 3/4 of the states. And so even the Equal Rights Amendment that was really widely supported ultimately couldn't make it through that process. So I don't really know much about, all I can say is also there are a lot of statutes to limit the budget deficits, and none of it has really worked out because it's a political process. And so if the participants in the political process want to evade some putative limit on their authority, they figure out a way to do it. So I personally, I wouldn't be waiting and hoping that that's going to solve any of our problems.
Over here, and then I got person over here and up front.
Hi, I'm interested in what I'm hearing here is that no matter what the Constitution says or what this bill, HR 669 is going to say, it won't stop the president from doing what he's going to do. Is that right? Is it that you just come back after the fact and see whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing? He doesn't have to face any situation, you know.
My assumption is that the president, whoever it might be at any given time, is going to comply with the law. And you know, we've had our ups and downs in the country, but overall, we operate under a rule of law, and that, so I would say, assuming that the president is not going to follow a law is, I think, not a correct assumption. And of course, there are responses politically and judicially if it's alleged that a president is not following the law, but that's not the norm. And of course, in some situations when you're talking about very rapid decisions, the if one is imagining some external enforcement mechanism besides the president's adherence to his or her oath of office, that's, I think, over-optimistic, because courts just can't carry out that particular function very well. And we care about what the law says, and we're affected by it, and office holders are. And you see, I mean, as I'm describing Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, he was really concerned that maybe his boss wouldn't follow the Constitution, and he took steps to try and make sure that problem didn't develop. And I think that's the way, no president is, I mean, a certain president may imagine the button on his desk that is the button, but the button just communicates with various other people. There'd be a lot of circuit breakers in there, and so having a law is very important, not just for the president and not just for the courts, but for everybody else involved in the process, because we have our traditions of attempting to adhere to the law. And I think I wouldn't downplay those. I think this law would respect those and try and implement it.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Joseph Malconi, and I'm a student at UC Davis. I have another question for Professor Sims. In the event that the president wishes to follow the law, but he doesn't approve of this law, for instance, in what ways can he combat it through the courts? I'm kind of confused, because normally it's my impression that you challenge a law by breaking it, but in the event that you break this kind of law,
See, that's the problem in that, and that's why President Nixon's veto statement on the War Powers Resolution said, I think this law is unconstitutional, at least in certain situations. In other words, if I'm engaged in military activity and I think the national interest requires continuation, and the 60 days or 90 days provided in the law expires, and it's going to require me to withdraw troops, that would be an infringement of my powers as Commander-in-Chief under Article 2. He can say that he's vetoed the law, and Congress repassed it in both houses by a 2/3 majority to put it into force. Now, some presidents have asserted subsequently that aspects of the War Powers Resolution are unconstitutional. But you see, if they tried to litigate that to get the law declared unconstitutional, now all of a sudden it flips in terms of the involvement of the courts. The courts are going to say, well, there isn't any ripe controversy yet. How can we imagine whether this law would be unconstitutional as it might apply in some future circumstance that nobody knows the details of? And so, or they might say just inherently it's a political question that we can't get into. So I would just say that, so I guess go back to the example about the treaty termination unilaterally by the president. The Supreme Court has said if a president terminates a treaty, at least under the circumstances that have come up so far, there's no way the courts can prevent that. And so if we think it's a good treaty that's being terminated, we say, oh, that's too bad. And if we think it's a bad treaty that's being terminated, we applaud. But the court is even-handed about it. They're just not going to get involved. And I think on these issues about constitutionality and enforcement of the kinds of statute that we're talking about here, no matter which way the legal challenge comes, to try and force it or to try to get the law off the books because it's obviously unconstitutional, I think the same non-involvement attitude by the courts in terms of certain types of problems would probably kick in. And there's that whole panoply of doctrines that would establish non-justiciability. So, ripeness and standing and political question and mootness, and then they invent new ones if they need it. So the president would probably be able to announce what he or she thought about the statute, but I'm kind of doubtful that the courts would step in and give some prediction about how it would operate under some unknown circumstances.
Well, I'm really thankful that we're having a robust questioning and answering period. we did have another section that we wanted to get to, and it was, where do we go from here? And we have maybe 5 more minutes. Do we want to continue with questions, or do we want to go to that, Bill? Bill.
Just very quickly, some housekeeping. The conversation that we've had with Professor Sims has a couple of takeaways that I want you to keep in mind. One is that displacing the conflict and displacing the resolution of the issues into the courts is an extremely uncertain and frankly disempowering event. And what I've heard Professor Sims say in several different ways is that displacing this issue and this conflict into the courts is not going to give us a clear, crisp resolution, and it's not going to give us the sort of certainty that we all want and that we all are being sort of forced to deal with by the events of the last year. That's certainly one takeaway that I have. What we've tried to do with this teach-in is to give you information and an opportunity to discuss in a context that's empowering. Nuclear weapons and military adventurism are issues that we are often told, hey, that's for the insiders, that's for the elites, that's for the experts to discuss. And that can be and is often very intimidating. And we do not want you to come away from this discussion feeling sort of intimidated, confused, and certainly based on Professor Sims' discussion, thinking that the courts can resolve this with an injunction or with a declaration. What this ultimately is about is learning. It's a teaching that's intended to give you information, to be empowering, and to give you a sense that, or to give us all a sense that we can develop a movement, we can move forward and enact some very specific laws that will move the locus of decision making away from the secrecy of the White House and into a public context with Congress. To that end, we've given you, we made 100 copies of a 50-page document that has an awful lot of background material. I don't know if all of you got one, but if you didn't, it's posted on the website of the Davis Democratic Club and on the website of the Verbs, and that information is available to you about a couple of different avenues that we as citizens can take. One, as Professor Sims has indicated, is the substantive policy, but also the budget, the power of the purse. Congressman Garamendi is going to be here and talk about, hopefully, both of those things. I want to say that on page 33 of the 50-page document is an outline of next steps that we can take. One, move political steps that can move the basic principle of legislative or congressional declaration for the first use of nuclear weapons. Second are things that are happening out in the world outside of the White House that are moving in a direction that we want to see and are the basis for starting to develop a movement and from which we should take a sense of empowerment. Those next steps, we want to have an interactive discussion, but we're hoping the Congressman will be here and he will then move things in his direction. Those next steps that we've identified include moving H.R. 669 forward. Currently, there are 73 members of Congress, including 19 members of Congress from California, who are co-sponsors. That's a third of the votes that are necessary in the Congress, in the House, to the Congressman is here. I'm going to defer to him at this point.
You're here. You can speak however long and as much as you want, and then if we would like to take questions, you field those questions, sir.
Well, we'll do questions. You've been at this a couple of hours, right? You've had some really important opportunities to learn. I was listening to some of the papers that have been written and made available. About 7 o'clock last night, I came back from a part of what I have to do, and that's to continue my education on the nuclear weapons of the United States. I spent most of Friday at Los Alamos National Laboratory, engaged in a long discussion and understanding of the way in which the United States makes the plutonium pits for the thermonuclear weapons. Those experiences, it's not my first at a national lab, nor my first tour of a manufacturing and research facility for nuclear weapons. But like the previous journeys that I have made to learn as much as I possibly could about this systems that we have, and others around the nation, around the world, China and Russia, as well as the Europeans. So I've had the opportunity to tour the French and the British nuclear facilities also. Not the Russians, and I don't suppose I will, or the Chinese. It is, many thoughts come from this, and Patty said, well, you'll be perfectly prepared to talk on Friday. And the fact of the matter is I'm perfectly unprepared, because the experience alters thinking. And I'm just wondering how it is that we have come to possess the power of the sun and to use it in such a destructive way. Incredibly intelligent people. I mean, the men, the women that are engaged in this enterprise are incredibly intelligent. And they are dedicated. And they are true believers that this is an essential part of America's security as well as perhaps international security. But I don't. I think we are working ourselves into a very, very difficult and very, very dangerous period ahead. Now, we've gone through this before. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read the book Command and Control. I would suggest if you are into horror movies that you don't waste your time on what Hollywood has produced, but rather take a look at what America has produced and the good fortune that we have had to avoid major nuclear disasters. Now, a couple of other things. I want to put this in some context and somehow try to remove myself from the tour of Los Alamos that I had yesterday and put it in a different context. Two numbers. One number is a number that was created by the United States Congress and the President in December, just before Christmas. It's a number that is somewhere $1.5 trillion. So that's a number. That is the amount of money that the American public has given to the top 1% of America's wealthy people and American corporations. $1.5 trillion, not including interest on that money, which will have to be borrowed. The other number is somewhere around the range of $1.2 trillion. These two numbers are important today because these are two numbers that work together. to deprive the world, and particularly America, of money that we desperately need to address climate change, which really is a profound problem, to address healthcare needs here in America and around the world, to address problems of plagues, Ebola, you know, name your favorite, Zika or whatever, to address economic development and skills that the American people need as the economy radically changes and jobs radically change, and people, like trees, are slower in changing in the face of climate change, as well as the people in the face of economic dislocation. So $1,200 billion is what we will spend in the next 15 years or so on rebuilding our entire nuclear systems, all of it. Every nuclear bomb, and there will be somewhere in the range of, I don't know, depends how this works out, 6, 8, maybe 9 different bombs. Every one of them, and there are more than a few thousand, will be rebuilt to be made safe, secure, and dependable. And so that's what the nuclear laboratories are doing. That's what Los Alamos is doing with the gearing up to be able to produce new plutonium pits. And the other laboratories also, Lawrence Livermore here in this region. So that is the bomb itself. Are they new? Well, you can get in a great debate about it, but let's just say that they are certainly updated. And in many ways that's important, because much of what was or is in the older bombs is not safe. So if you're going to have one, you would kind of like it to be safe. You don't want it to go off on random or other ways that would be not nice. So, okay, that's going to take place. Then the delivery systems. The B-52 is well over 50 years old and probably will fly for another 40 years or so, but nonetheless it will also be updated. And the other bombers will phase out, while the new B-21 bomber will come into place at about $500 million a copy. So we will have those. We will also have a new strike fighter bomber, the F-35, and that'll be what is known as a dual purpose. It'll be able to eventually, not now, right now it's conventional, it will be able to deliver nuclear weapons at some point in the future, so that's another delivery system. And since our bombers are not able to get into heavily defended spaces, aerial denial, that is, somebody has some really good anti-aircraft missiles, we have to, they say, develop a new long-range cruise missile that we can then attach to the new bomber, because a new bomber can't go there and get back safely, so we're going to have a new cruise missile, and that will also be put in place. The submarines, the submarine-launched ballistic missile submarines are aging out, and so we are now in the process of building a new Columbia-class submarine. There'll be a few of those, exact number to be determined, but probably in the range of more than 10, and they will be extremely expensive. And those are in the process of being built now. And There may or may not be a new missile to go with that, but there is going to be a new missile to replace the ICBMs that are in the various silos in the upper Midwest. So you put all of that together, over to the next 15 years, it'll be $1 trillion, 200. Today's estimate, tomorrow's estimate will be larger. I mean, that's just the way this goes. And so match that against the $1 trillion, 500 billion that was handed over to the corporations and to the top 1% of the wealthy Americans. And you go, this does not work. It won't work. And so much of my work in Congress is to, as I told the folks at Los Alamos, I said, I'm here because I have 3 letters on my mind. W-H-Y. Why? And I said, I'm going to ask that question repeatedly during this visit, and I have been asking that question in the 7 years, 8 years that I've been on the Armed Services Committee as a member of the Strategic Arms Subcommittee. Strategic arms mean nuclear. It also means all of the satellites in space that observe what's going on around the world and certainly keep track of nuclear activities that other countries are engaged in. Now, we live in a very dangerous world. Some of that danger is of America's creation, particularly our president, his inconsistency, his verbosity, his bullying, his tweets create a very dangerous situation, to say nothing of his mind, which is, in my view, neither stable nor genius. So all of this comes at a time when we have a situation in North Korea that has been pursuing a nuclear weapon for some decades now, probably more than 20 years, and has successfully developed a nuclear weapon. And some sort of a delivery system. Exactly how good it is, we could have a significant debate. If this was a classified setting, I could probably share more with you, but let's just say they do have a delivery system. So all of that leads us to a situation that is exceedingly dangerous. Russia and China are doing exactly what we are doing. They are upgrading, renewing, repurposing, and in ways similar to the United States, creating new and better delivery systems for their nuclear weapons. So we are very, very much, not even considering North Korea and Iran and perhaps a few other players around the world like Pakistan and India, we are very, very much engaged in a new nuclear arms race that is really a 3-legged race at the moment, not taking into account, as I say, India and Pakistan, and maybe Iran and North Korea. That arms race, like the previous one, is exceedingly dangerous, and this one is different. Those weapon systems, the delivery systems that I described, not so much the bombs themselves, but the delivery systems are stealthy. They are designed not to be observed. Now, during the previous arms race and what we knew as the Cold War, we had developed, as had Russia and China, well, China to a lesser extent because they really were minor players at that time, but certainly Russia. Both countries had developed ways of observing what the other country was doing. Satellites that could observe immediately a rocket launch through infrared and radar and a few other mechanisms. And we knew that there was a certain period of time, we had hotlines, there were protocols in place, and there was a whole series of procedures, as well as sensing and that would alert. And so both sides knew what was going on, and that created stability. Although for those who are worried about a nuclear explosion, it was, and I guess a level of anxiety, but nonetheless it was a stable situation. We're not in a stable situation today because much of what we are trying to do, and we know Russia's trying to do, and China also, is creating delivery systems that are not observable. And so all of that is going on. The other thing that is happening is that Star Wars is real. I'm not referring to the movie. I'm referring to space war. It's very real. We talked about this during the Reagan period, and a lot of folks poo-hooed it and said that's a movie and not to worry, but that was nearly 35 years ago, and in the intervening years, everybody's figured out how to wage war in space. And the problem here is that that's where the information is developed that alerts both sides, or all sides, to an impending attack. And therefore, a very unstable situation is created. Satellites sometimes don't work. Why? Because Russia knocked them out in anticipation of an attack on us. Or maybe the Russian satellite isn't working because we locked it out because we're going to attack. And so the problem with space is that all of us, China, Russia, and the United States, are dependent upon space as the mechanism to learn of the opponent's intentions and actions. Intentions, anticipating what's going on, observing the movement of material, and rockets and other things from one place to another. And so that's a problem. That's a very, very real problem. And so how to deal with that? There are no rules about what countries do in space. There was an attempt some years ago to set up various treaties that you're not supposed to do nasty things in space, but that didn't happen. And so that remains a problem. So here's where I'm going to leave it go and then go to your questions. A couple of things going forward. The two big numbers that I gave you will cause soon Congress, your government, my government, and my work to come to a decision point. We cannot do it all. Just can't do it. Oh, that $1 trillion infrastructure over the next 10 years, and so forth. So there's going to be a day of financial reckoning sometime, I don't know, this year's gone so crazy, it's not going to get any better. Well, what are we, today's the 13th? I think it's been a very full 13 days. So, you know, you look at that and you go, probably not this year, because of all the things that are going on, and then tomorrow morning's tweet or yesterday's tweet. But Congress cannot ignore the fact that the money's not available. And the demand for everything else will push against the nuclear enterprise. You know, there's been a lot of hearings. If you follow this very closely and you follow the work that I've done in committee, I keep asking the question, how are you going to pay for this? Where's the money? And a few of the top generals, General Silva specifically, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, yeah, it's a problem. Yes, General, it's a problem. So how are we going to do it? And the tax bill makes it that much keener a problem and a much a problem that will arrive much sooner. So maybe we can say we should delay some of these activities. Now, without going into a great deal of detail, because I shouldn't do that, we really do not need, in the next decade, and maybe longer, to replace with a new missile the ICBMs that are in the silos in the upper Midwest. The missiles work, and they've worked for 30 years, and they're going to work for a lot longer. But they want to build new ones. Not necessary in the near term being 10 to 15 years. Do we need to, and here's a fundamental question I keep asking, one of those why questions. Why do we have a triad? Well, because we have a triad. That's why we have a triad. But it's a profoundly important question because that then leads to many other very expensive and in many cases dangerous paths that we travel. And okay, what are these weapons? Which is another question. Why do we have the weapon and what is it for? Well, is it deterrence? If so, how many do you need for deterrence? Which basically says, how many do you need to flatten your opponent? I mean, really flatten it. And as Trump said, you just have a lot of glass left behind. So you turn the earth to glass. How many do you need? And what's the best way of achieving that deterrence? Do you need a triad to do it? My opinion is you do not. But we have a triad, so why not keep it? Because after all, we want to be really certain that we have a deterrent. The second question has to do with what are these weapons for beyond deterrence? Now, this is a very, very important question right now. It's an important question right now because the president and the military and others are putting together what is known as the Nuclear Posture Review. The Nuclear Posture Review basically is the American government's policy for nuclear weapons. Where we're going to use them, how we're going to use them, and all of the other elements. Two pieces of it. One is a classified document, and the other is the public document, said to come out in the next month, maybe. It'll be very, very important. In that Nuclear Posture Review, there is a possibility that an old use for nuclear weapons will re-emerge. And that is that a nuclear weapon will be used for conventional warfare, not for deterrence, but rather as a augmentation to a bomb, a chemical bomb. We used to do a lot of this. In fact, we probably had 30,000 or so nuclear weapons, some of them in a suitcase, designed, literally. Many of them in a 155 millimeter cannon shell. And so you can make these things many different purposes. Those were to be used for conventional warfare. You know, the Russians were going to send their tanks through the Fola Gap, and we were going to bomb them, and that would stop the Russians, and so forth. There is serious consideration that we would once again consider using nuclear weapons and building a new weapon and a new delivery system, or repurposing an older delivery system to once again develop a conventional nuclear bomb strategy. Most rational people, my view of rationality, would say, don't do that, not necessary. And not particularly useful. The Russians have what they call a strategy called escalate to de-escalate. In other words, they have a specific strategy to use, or at least they say they have a strategy, to use a nuclear weapon to, in a conventional war between NATO and Russia, or I don't know who else Russia would fight, China, somebody, to use a nuclear weapon to de-escalate the conflict, bring the opponent to the table. People who I would say are rational say, you would hope that would be the case, but the more likely result is it would be a tit for tat. And it would be an escalation that would escalate. And besides that, it is a nuclear weapon. Maybe a little smaller than a larger bomb, but nonetheless a nuclear weapon. This is being debated in the United States by our military and other nuclear weapons thinkers, and may very well be the policy of the Trump administration. My personal view is don't do it, because the use of that nuclear weapon is not particularly useful. Now, you know, war games, if you were to play out a war game in the Baltic countries, or play out that war game on the eastern edge of NATO, there really isn't a good use of a nuclear weapon. We can go into detail. If you're into war games and into that kind of thing, you may want to read a lot of books about it. But it just doesn't work too well. In fact, it doesn't work well at all. Because basically you're bombing yourself. And that's not a particularly good thing to do. So we'll see what happens. My policy on this is we shouldn't go there. And I'll do what I can to stop that from happening. I'm certainly going to lose the vote. I lose most votes in the subcommittee, but nonetheless, I keep asking the questions and forcing a debate on it. So we'll see what takes place with this. It would require a different delivery system, maybe. It could be, we could use the existing systems that we have, the B-12 bomb and its variations, or the new repurposed B-12. Anyway, that's out there. So that's one thing. Do not go into ever thinking, once again, about using the nuclear weapon in a conventional fight. Secondly, go slow on building these new, very, very expensive delivery systems, some of which are going to be exceedingly troublesome. The new hypersonic weapon is very, very troublesome. Almost impossible to know what it is, where it's coming. The LSRO, long-range standoff cruise missile, troublesome. It's both conventional and nuclear. It's coming at you. Is it nuclear or is it conventional? Well, we don't know, so let's just assume it's nuclear, because if it is, we're in deep trouble. So therefore, we're going to get the other guy in deep trouble, and now we have a nuclear war going on. So these are questions that are up before us. And secondly, I don't believe we're going to have the money to do all of this that is currently planned. Now, what should you do? You should engage. You should engage. The Congress is presently controlled by a very, very conservative political party, one that does not believe the United States has enough nuclear weapons and enough delivery systems and can never spend enough money on all of this. So engage if you think these policies that are being pursued by my colleagues in Congress and the military are incorrect. You should engage politically. So if you've got questions, let's take a few moments and see if we can do that. You get to go first.
I take it you're clapping for him, not me. Could we get a bill to destroy, replace nuclear weapons without selling them or giving them away?
I'm sorry. I couldn't quite make out what you
Could
said.
we get a bill to destroy replaced nuclear weapon systems without giving them away or selling them?
The nuclear weapons, if I understood your question correctly, I'll repeat it. I may very well have heard it incorrectly. Can we eliminate one of these without giving it away, and how do we destroy it? Is that what you're doing?
Can we give them, when we do replace them, can we get rid of the ones we've replaced?
Yes, and we are. At one point, we had more than 30,000 nuclear bombs. I don't think you heard the deployable number earlier during the earlier discussions. There are different categories. The actual number kind of wanders around somewhere between 5 and, I don't know, maybe 10. Those are not deployed and presumed are not to be used. They're sitting on a shelf in storage. We do have somewhere over 100 metric tons of plutonium that we don't know what to do with, and we've not been able to destroy that, although that's another thing I've been working on, trying to figure out how to do that. We did have a treaty with Russia, an understanding with Russia to destroy, for them to destroy their unused plutonium, and for us. Every one of those nuclear weapons has a plutonium pit, and that's sitting in storage someplace, hopefully secure. So yes, we can destroy them. It is one of the things we were looking at Los Alamos. How do you deal with those very dangerous, highly radioactive and troublesome, very long-lived transuranic materials? Okay. I'll leave you to figure it out.
Okay.
I'm not going to pick winners and
All
losers.
right,
That's
I
bad
will
politics.
wander, Congressman, like Phil Donahue.
Okay.
Congressman Garamendi, thank you very much for your candid and highly informational remarks. We haven't heard that from a member of Congress in a very long time. I want to commend you for that. So I just have a question as the former mayor of a nuclear-free zone. You know, I have a question about the 25th Amendment, and you know where that's going.
I think we all do.
And so I don't think I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to instead ask you, since, you know, I have 3 grandkids, and this Christmas we talked about the instability in the world. They're starting to feel it. And so you mentioned instability. You mentioned, and others have mentioned, the instability of the president. What is it that allows you to sleep at night? What is it? I mean, do you, I guess what I'm really getting at is, do you have faith that there's light at the end of the tunnel on these issues? As you serve in Congress, do you see leverage? Do you see handles we can get on this? I'm asking you for that. And maybe that's the call you don't want. Please don't, yes.
No, it's not the White House.
Okay, it's not the White House, okay. But you see where my question is going, and I just, well, you know, you've given it a lot of thought, but how does it feel?
Some of you may have observed some of the national television I've done over the last week or so. And I'll probably do it again on Monday with Wolf Blitzer. I am very outspoken that the president is neither stable, rational, or capable of handling the profound problems that confront any president. And in fact, he is creating a very unstable world. And I'm just going to, I'm speaking out on it. I intend to continue to do so in ways that I guess some would consider to be pejorative, and it is. But I really believe we got a problem here. Last week, Wednesday afternoon in my office, then again Wednesday night, spent almost 3 hours with Bandy Lee, and she discussed her book, not her book, but the 27 mental health experts around the nation that contributed to that book. And a very convincing argument is being made by her and maybe another 1,000 mental health experts saying this man is not suited for the job for a variety of reasons. It was almost 2 years ago that I went to the floor of the House and said, there's something seriously wrong when a fellow that wants to be president is a schoolyard bully, which he did during his primary and general campaign. He's also a stalker. If you watch the debate with Hillary Clinton, that was an extraordinary indication of his mind. He doesn't know what the truth is. Anyway, I go on and on. Anyway, he has created a very serious problem for the world and for the United States. It's going to take the United States many years to repair the damage that he has done in our international relationships with our allies, to say nothing of our opponents. But with our allies, he has created a very, very significant problem. So, and that brings me back to this whole nuclear issue, and that's why Ted Lieu and I are the principal authors of a piece of legislation that says there will be no first strike use of a nuclear weapon without an authorization of war by Congress. The other thing is that we need to empower our military. Our military leaders need to know that the Congress of the United States has their back. I know these gentlemen and ladies, and they're smart, they're capable, and they know the power that they possess with their weapons. And they understand what will happen if those weapons, particularly the nuclear weapons, are ever used. And so they have an opportunity to say, let's think about this. Let's not go off fully cocked. And so we need to make sure that they know that we want them to ask the question. Why do you want to do that, Mr. President? What are the results of that action? And so that we need to do that, just generally all of us. And certainly those of us in Congress that are working with the military need to make sure that we want them to pause, to ask the question. And wait till the next morning, because there's going to be a different view in the next morning's tweet. So, thank you.
I'm going to go back here, Congressman, and then I'll go up front, then I'll go over to the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Those were wonderful comments. I'm much encouraged. I especially like that you tell us to get engaged, but how? I've been voting Democratic since I was 21, and yes, I'm going down to the Central Valley to work to turn the red states blue. I will be at the Women's March, but give us some encouragement that Congress hears us. Join us on the streets. We need a Pied Piper to encourage us, to encourage you. I feel very lost, and I'm working very hard, and I feel it falls on deaf ears. Much of the DNC is very conservative. It seems to me it's trying to preserve political ground, and that's not necessarily saving the country. So help us out. Tell us what to do. We want to work with you.
I don't need... You do not need me to tell you what to do, because you are doing what must be done. You are traveling. You said the Central Valley. I suspect I know where you may be headed. I think some of you were around in the 60s, maybe just a handful of you. And I think all of you, those of you that were, and maybe those of you that have watched the CNN decade shows, the decade of the 60s, the demonstrations that took place during that period of time, you know, it was part of my life, part of Patty's life, and we were involved in civil rights and the anti-war and so forth. The day after the inaugural, the demonstration that the women of America put forth was several times greater than anything that occurred during the anti-war movement. I'm not going to say the civil rights, that was really a different situation, but it was incredible, and it has not diminished at all. It has spread out, and I believe in 2018, that power, that determination, and the concern that women have about the future that men seem not to possess will manifest in a very different Congress in January of 2019. And so, carry on, my true believer. Peter Yarrow and his daughter have a beautiful song, and that's it, Carry On. And it's all about this issue. Never give up. Okay, next question.
Good afternoon, Congressman.
Hello, Assemblywoman.
Hi, how are you?
I am well, thank you.
I've enjoyed this conversation today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you, Bill Jillian, the Democratic Club, for inviting me and to enlighten me. And I just want to let everyone know that we can engage. I will be introducing a resolution in the Assembly urging Congress to swiftly pass H.R. 669. I would sincerely ask for all of you your support and to keep an eye on it, and we will be working with the Democratic Club here as well as others to get that through.
To talk about it a little bit.
Well, we're still working on it. Bill, Jillian, and myself and our team, as well as Darian. Darian, would you stand up? She's my legislative aide. We're putting it together. We hope to introduce it sooner than later. But we will be backing and getting in contact with your office as well as Congressman Liu. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. An experienced mayor knows to work the back first and then to get to the front.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time and for coming in. Eric Goods, and I initially, when I heard a lot about some initial action that you've been taking on this issue, I was very impressed and very proud to have you as my congressman. And with some of the work that I've been engaged with Indivisible YOLO, that definitely was a very strong indicator of the significance and power that we have at the local level of our government, and local civic engagement can really bring to strengthen and amplify your message and the work that you're doing in Congress. And so kind of going off of that vein, something I was really interested to ask you about personally was whether or not you see any opportunity you see here with the Assemblywoman offering her support and the work that she's going to be doing at the State House. I'm thinking about sort of the work that we can do here locally in Davis to support you, perhaps through some collaborative action at a town hall, something that Indivisible YOLO and other activated groups can support you with that. So I'd like to ask you about sort of any future plans you might have for future town halls in the area here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words and the support. I must tell you, I don't know how many times I've stood before an audience and talked on virtually every subject in a Wikipedia. Preaching to the choir is very satisfying. But it is the sinners that you really want to get into the church. So there may be some in Davis that are not aligned in the discussion that we've had here today. I would recommend trying to find them and preach to them is a task that would have a small result. However, we were just talking, I don't know where you went, but you were talking about traveling to other areas. Take the message where it needs to be heard. Take the message, this message of this nuclear concerns, the message of the president, his instability, that message, the tax message, whatever, take that message where it needs to be heard. And the bottom line of this is that unless Congress and the Senate, Congress or the Senate, better yet, Congress and the Senate, if they were to change and democratic control, we would then be able to move, I believe, rationally on all of the issues that I've talked here and most others, from climate change to economy to tax policy and nuclear weapons and so forth. Until that happens, it is a defensive fight. So my suggestion is to flip 14. Where does the 14 come from? There are 14 Republicans remaining in the California delegation. There may be better opportunities around, and there are things that you can do that travel, not so far. Modesto's not that far away. McClintock, so forth. But there also, you have relatives somewhere around the United States. You've got a friend that's going to school in Ohio. Engage and reach out beyond. The organizing that's done in the church is necessary because that is the group that then goes out. Okay, so you organize here and then you go out to find the sinners.
One more question for you, sir. Here, right up here, over here.
Okay. Actually, my name's Greg Adams. I'd like to thank you very much for what you're doing. Anyway, mine is actually just a little bit of information I'd like to share. I actually worked on nuclear bombers, and we actually had a computer glitch that gave us weapons free. The end of the world was 18 minutes away. And this was a computer glitch. And Command and Control has many of them listed, but not all of them. There's many, many more. We need to take these weapons off of hair trigger. We need to eliminate them. I knew that my life was over in 18 minutes, and my family, they were just a few miles away. And unfortunately, half of them were in Hawaii this morning, and they went through the same damn thing. And this has got to stop. We got to end this. We can't live on this with the sword of Damocles hanging over us. Or sword of Damocles hanging over us. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. The last question is this young lady over here is about to have her shoulder dislocated, so.
It just is back to HR 669. Now, obviously, getting the budget passed is going to take up a lot of time and Congress, and if this bill does pass, and when Congress gets around to even dealing with it, it still has a lot of hurdles to get through before it becomes law, not to mention having the president sign it and approve it. So, but is it enough, even if just if the House even just put that stand and we're able to get it through, would be that enough to uncouple the system that could lead to an attack? In other words, we've had this conversation about empowering the military and whether or not the president could be dissuaded or even removed from being just completely deliriously insane.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'm going to go back and plow this field very, very quickly because it's already been plowed once. The legislation, it would be exceedingly important to pass that piece of legislation, not just for this president, but for any president. The first use of a nuclear weapon is a very, very bad idea. It will inevitably result in a nuclear war. We talked a lot about the use of a nuclear weapon in a conventional war. Escalate to de-escalate, not likely. Escalate would probably lead to escalation. So the use of a nuclear weapon with this president or any president is a bad idea. Now, do we have a chance of passing it? I think there are two things that would lead to that answer. The first is Trump. You know, what's tomorrow morning's tweet? What additional irrationality will he be displaying? There is in Congress a lot of some Republicans, maybe a lot of Republicans, that are going, we got a problem. They know it. They're not willing to speak out because they want their legislation passed. Well, by the way, the second step, you know those two numbers I gave you, $1.5 trillion and $1.2 trillion? Do you know what the solution is? Cut Medicare, cut Social Security, cut Medicaid. That's how they're going to do it. And we're going to be in that fight probably within 2 weeks. But that's kind of it. So, you know, the Republicans want to do the Ryan budget. They've wanted to do that for 5 years in the House of Representatives, 6 years now. And they're willing to put up with the president so he would sign it. However, a level of irrationality such as Haiti and Nigeria, and you go, come on. So maybe. The second thing about that bill is the more people, the more members we can get to support it, the message to the military becomes clearer. These two things work together. Okay? I want to thank all of you. Really, I want you to spend your time at this. I'm going to stick around for about another 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then I've got another meeting this evening. So thank you so very, very much.
And I, as the club president, want to thank Professor Sims and Ms. Bidgood. Thank you very much. And thank you, church.